for all of us. It's about predicting where the consumer is going and getting half of it right.
One of the things we want to do is create ads that don't suck.
Embracing change creates great possibility.
I'm Alan Hart, and this is Marketing Today.
Today on the show, I've got Kim Wijkstrom, Chief Marketing Officer at OneMain Financial. Kim's responsible for the development and execution of the brand marketing at OneMain Financial, and he's successfully launched a new brand campaign called Lending Done Human. And we get into that campaign, the success that he's seen and, the spark, if you will, or how that campaign came about to begin with. We also touch on his prior career, starting in advertising and working with some iconic brands like Apple and Absolut Vodka. And we end, as usual, with getting to know Kim more on a personal level, his Swedish background, growing up in West Africa. You're not going to want to miss this episode with Kim Wijkstrom. Well, Kim, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Alan. Pleasure to be here.
We've got a lot to talk about, but I thought we could start with your background and where you started your career and kind of any twists or turns along the way.
Sure. Yeah, I started in marketing at TBWA Chiat back in 96 after finishing business school at NYU. And I was incredibly lucky to start at a time when TBWA Chiat had both Absolut Vodka and Apple as clients. And because of the fortuitous timing, I had the opportunity to work on Apple computer when Apple came back to Chiat, when Steve Jobs came back to Apple and brought it back to Chiat, and started there as an account supervisor / strategic planner. It's a strange hybrid job to help participate in figuring out the Think Different launch, which was, obviously a pivotal moment for me in my career and learning a lot in terms of brand strategy and brand positioning and so on and so forth. I also had the good fortune of working on what was already a very successful, one of the most successful campaigns probably in history, which is the Absolut Vodka account, where I was the resident Swede, if you will, on the agency side. So to me, those were incredibly exciting times, and both of them taught me some very significant lessons in terms of the importance of brand and the role that brand plays in the strategic growth of a business. That was obviously something that was core to Steve Jobs coming back to Apple, sorting out a new platform where Apple was no longer Apple Computer. It was now about digital tools for creative minds, which eventually resulted in the kind of earth-shattering developments like the iPhone, the iPod, so on and so forth, changing the entire direction of the company. It launched obviously with the Think Different campaign, which was a way of trying to create reappraisal for what Apple stood for, and ultimately paid off in the product and the product experience in retail.
Got it. Well, that's working on Apple when Steve Jobs came back. That's an amazing experience just in and of itself. Were there any major takeaways from that experience? The team that you got to work with. I'm assuming Lee Clow was in full swing and full force at that moment in time as well.
I don't think at the time I realized how lucky I was to be thrown into that situation. It was more trying to absorb as much as possible from the moment and roll with it and make sure that we could deliver on the relationship. So we did have a kickoff meeting with Steve Jobs that I will never forget. He was quite an intimidating figure. But again, to me, it was one of the most fundamental learning episodes of my career in seeing how, again, the storytelling that comes with brand is key to a business strategy, essentially, right? Determining what the strategy is has everything to do with brand, and then brand becomes the story that explains it to the consumer, becomes the consumer interface. That was something that was made abundantly clear in that process. And one other thing that I learned there was the reason I was brought on board was the Apple contract was a global contract, but TBWA Chiat did not have a TBWA Latin America, for example. So although we were responsible for doing the advertising there, we didn't actually have a structure or infrastructure to support it. So part of my job was to then figure out, okay, how do we take this campaign and apply it to foreign markets like those in Latin America, which became part of my job also for Absolut Vodka later on, in that basically I became the person who Absolut was so well established as a print campaign, and probably was the most famous print campaign at the time, truly an iconic campaign, but it also was looking for opportunities in new markets and in new media. This is the beginning of the dot-com bubble, if you will. So that became my role for Absolut Vodka as well.
Interesting. Well, I think when we previously talked, you mentioned this notion of being a translator of sorts, especially on the Absolut account, because of your heritage and being Swedish by descent, correct?
Correct. Yes, I'm a Swedish citizen as well as a U.S. citizen.
Okay. And so I don't hear an accent. Why is that? Your English is impeccable.
It's a good question. I moved to the U.S. in high school, and I had a strong accent then. Somewhere at some point during college, it, I think, just faded away. It may have something to do with being a parent. I don't know. Maybe I just sort of copy the environment somehow or other, subconsciously.
Right. I don't know. I grew up in the South in the U.S., and most people say I don't have a Southern accent, but if I drink a little too much, it's definitely going to come back out. Or if I'm around other people.
There you go.
So maybe if we had more, if I was Swedish, your Swedish would come out.
If we had some Absolut Vodka and used some bourbon, maybe we could make this work.
There we go. I like that. New show episode coming soon. Well, kind of getting back to translator component, you talked about, on Apple actually helping them into other markets as well. And I know it was a case on Absolut. Is there anything you learned in that kind of unique, if you will, middle role of being a translator between cultures or between different constituents?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when you have lived a life like I had, I was born and raised in Liberia in West Africa. I moved to Sweden, which is my heritage, in basically junior high school. Then I moved to the US and became an American. Then I worked in advertising eventually. And I worked with, in Absolut's case, a brand from Sweden, where in some sense I was, a cultural translator, in that I understood not just what our clients were actually saying to each other in meetings, but I couldn't interpret really what they meant by it, or what their actions or lack of actions may imply, because I understood the culture. The way that translated, I think it comes from being sort of culturally curious, which probably has something to do with having lived in many places, right? In many different environments. And the way that eventually translated into what happened in my career was, when it came to this notion of new markets and new channels, I was very curious about the promises of the interactive World Wide Web, all brand new, everything that everyone was talking about at the time. I was also culturally very curious about, Latin America, for example. And in the combination of helping try to build TBWA Latin America country by country in order to support both the Apple Think Different campaign and the Absolut Vodka campaign, I got to do a lot of cultural deep dives into those countries and learn very specifically how they differ from each other. It's sort of a little bit of a truism, I think, in advertising, that whenever you go to a new country, everyone will tell you that it's all different and nothing that you've done in the US will really apply. That's a truth with modification, but in order to test it, you actually have to go deep and try to figure out what is underlying here, what is universal in our brand proposition versus what needs to be adapted or solved for in the local market. And that's a very intriguing kind of cultural interrogation that I really enjoyed.
Right. No, to learn something that, I guess, early or pivotal in your career, I think is a great opportunity too.
Yeah.
Something you can carry on to each role you were in after that, for sure. If we think about, your career, and we're going to get to your real job now, I promise, in another question. But if we think about your career kind of leading up to OneMain Financial, has there been any main takeaways about the job as a marketer or an advertiser, so to speak?
Yeah, to me, I think I'm very much shaped by those early experiences with Absolut and with Apple, in that I really believe, and I think this is where I feel very strongly, that the distractions of sort of the daily news cycle of whatever is the new shiny toy in marketing and advertising, whether it's AI or blockchain or virtual reality or programmatic, they tend to distract from the fundamental, which is, if you don't have a story to tell, it doesn't really matter where you would tell it.
Right.
Those items are channels or levers in the overall marketing mix. And they're important and they're exciting and they're interesting. They don't change the fundamental, though. You need to have a brand, an articulated brand story that you can continue to evolve and extrapolate to those various channels. And that, to me, I think is the most fundamental thing that seems to get lost in a lot of the sort of Sturm und Drang in the marketing world.
Yeah, I 100% agree with you. I think we've got, as a function, as an industry, maybe a little ADD or attention deficit disorder. But let's talk about OneMain Financial.
Sure.
Can you, I guess first describe the company for those that are listening that may not be in a market, because we do have listeners outside the US, what OneMain Financial is, and what you've learned so far, like when you joined and what you've been, what journey you've been on, I guess, so to speak.
Absolutely. When I first got the opportunity to engage with OneMain Financial, I will admit I had my hesitations because I did learn very quickly that it was about personal loans and it really targeted the subprime population. Having survived the financial crisis of 2008 myself, that left me with some pause. However, what was really interesting, what compelled me eventually, both from the perspective as a human being as well as a marketer, was that what I learned is that the state of the American middle class is really quite bad. While we again tend to focus on certain news items such as the Dow Jones or the GDP or unemployment, the reality is that the vast majority of the middle class basically lost and have never recovered a significant part of their earnings relative to their expenses since 2008. There have been all sorts of studies by the Federal Reserve showing that something like 60% of the American public would not have $1,000 in cash to access in an emergency. And given everything else we know about what's going on in our country with the cost of healthcare and everything else, that could be potentially quite catastrophic. And since the financial crisis, the banks have actually unbanked those customers that they do not feel so good about, which tends to be characterized as subprime, which, by the way, is a terrible pejorative to dismiss people as subprime or sub anything. But the banks have basically unbanked something like 60 million people since the financial crisis. So where do these folks turn when they're in need of a loan? They go through the path of turning to friends and family, they go to a bank, they go to credit unions, they go to a credit card, and along the way they get turned down. The options that remain to them are not the best. And OneMain Financial is the largest consumer financial services company in the US that you've never heard of because they've never really tried to build a brand before this. I think partly because of the category that they were in, which wasn't one that was highly respected. But in my view, what OneMain Financial takes very seriously and takes great pride in is being the one responsible lender in this category. So you can go to a payday lender or a title lender, and basically we're talking about usury rates there. What OneMain Financial does is something very different. They will create an installment loan that's based on your income and your expenses to make sure that it's something that you can afford. To me, this felt like something that I felt very strongly about. It felt like someone who's doing the responsible thing that is actually severely needed in our country right now. And from a marketing perspective, what was exciting about it was the fact that no one's ever heard of the company because since 1912, really the only way that they have reached out to customers is through direct mail. So no awareness building had been done, and there was an opportunity here to actually create a brand for a company whose retail footprint is almost the size of Target's. That seemed like an exciting proposition to me.
Yeah. Well, I know you mentioned before, I think that 1,700 branches. I think Target has something like 1,800 stores. Don't quote me on that, but that's crazy. You're everywhere.
It's kind of amazing, right? I mean, close to 90% of Americans live within 25 miles of a OneMain Financial branch.
That's wild. When we were gearing up for this interview, I had the same thoughts about the industry or the sector of the industry that you're in. But the more I've heard you talk about it, it seems like, it's a dire need for people that need access to cash. And it seems like you're OneMain Financial is taking the appropriate approach to it, right? Versus the payday loan folks that get such a bad rap in the industry.
And I think that that's something really important, Alan. I mean, I am very passionate about marketing and advertising, but I also don't think I could be doing it for a company that I wouldn't feel passionate about. And I do feel that OneMain Financial is actually doing a necessary and a responsible service to the customers out there. So I do feel passionate about helping that customer and making sure that that customer understands that there is an option, a responsible option for them, and that they can turn to someplace that can help them explain what they're getting into, which is the whole promise behind lending done human.
Got it. So you just illuminated, I guess, the tagline, right? Lending done human, and you recently launched the company's first ever brand campaign. Was that part of your remit when you took the job, and how'd you approach that?
So yes, that was part of the remit when I took the job. And the way we went about it was a lot of the same way I went about trying to understand, for example, how Apple Think Different should be different in Brazil from Colombia, or how Absolut Vodka's strategy in Mexico should differ from the US. Taking a deep dive into the consumer and the culture and trying to understand the dynamics in this space. What we've seen since the financial crisis is a significant growth in online lenders, the fintech companies as they're more commonly known as. That space has grown a lot. But when we did research with our customers and customers in our target group as well, what we understood there was that there's a lot of fear involved with this, which is not surprising. I mean, if you're in dire straits and need access to credit and everyone's rejecting you, where do you turn to? And you want to turn to someone that you've heard of and that you believe is reputable. Without any awareness out there, basically what ends up happening is when they stumble upon us or one of our direct mail pieces arrives in the mailbox, they may seize the opportunity, but they're not necessarily that excited about it or not necessarily that reassured because they haven't heard of us. So one thing we learned was that the awareness was important to the customers, that they would have heard of the company, that they would believe that it was reputable. The other thing that we learned in the research is that this is kind of a high-touch category, believe it or not. Consumers were expressing fear because of the concern of making any mistakes if they go online and book a loan, or if they go to someone who doesn't really particularly help them in terms of finding the right loan for their particular needs. So they really expressed a deep desire to have someone to help them, to speak to them so that they could ask questions and figure out how to understand the loan and the loan process itself. So it turned out that the major differentiator we had sort of built into the company, which is these 1,600, 1,700 branches, is actually a real asset with regards to what consumers were asking for, what they wanted.
Interesting. Lending done human, I do really love that line, by the way. How did you, and you talked about it being a high touch category, how did you work with, quote unquote, the humans inside the company to help you launch this effort?
Very closely, because one thing we discovered also in doing internal surveys is there's a great pride in doing what we do. The team members at OneMain Financial feel very strongly about being sort of responsible members of the community. They have long-standing relationships with a lot of their customers. So they felt that the spotlight was essentially put on them in terms of recognizing what they are already trying to do in their communities, trying to help those who have been somewhat disenfranchised, and providing the kind of human shoulder or ear, if you will, for customers who are looking for a solution. And we found that there's great pride in the feeling of being able to help. So the previous tagline, if you want to call it that the company had was lending made personal, which was trying to be a little bit of a pun on the notion of personal loans. But the problem with it was we found out, again, through research that consumers don't really know what a personal loan is. So the pun is kind of lost. And twisting it and turning it to lending done human actually captured both the way our team members feel about what they do provide to their communities, but also provides kind of a promise to consumers of what to expect when they come into the store.
It's really, it's a interesting, with so many branches and so many people out, like you said, out in their personal communities, that they have that attachment to the communities and that the people that they're trying to serve. I can't help but think they probably had at times, right? Similar connotations. I believe I'm helping somebody, but our industry gets a bad rap. And maybe this also helps them bring out their humanness. I don't know. That sounds really odd to say out loud, but hopefully that makes sense.
It does. And I think we've seen it very much internally. So we do have every now and then, and this probably isn't something I should broadcast because we don't want to advertise it, but we do have requests from branches for a particular customer who had a particular situation happen to them, a particularly dire situation, and they want to figure out a way to help. And every now and then we do that simply because we think it's the right thing to do. And we actually videotape when the branch invites the customer in and either provides something that will be helpful to them, like a wheelchair, let's say, or a check for whatever medical emergency happened or something along those lines. And we don't share it out externally. We only share it internally within our intranet. But it is the kind of thing that builds a lot of pride internally with our team members.
That's awesome. That's awesome. As you think about pushing, this campaign externally, how are you getting it out into the world, and how are you, planning to, or are you reaching your target audiences?
So yes, we are. We have started small. We've started in 5 markets with a fully integrated campaign, meaning led by TV, but also using drive time radio, digital advertising, social media, and billboards. And what we're seeing is the awareness spiked, but most importantly, the perception in those markets changed significantly. So now that there's a trust factor involved with OneMain Financial, which is really, really encouraging. On top of which, of course, there are other KPIs such as direct traffic to the website and searches and so on and so forth that are spiking as well. But to me, what's really rewarding is to see that the awareness has paid off in terms of shifting perceptions in those markets.
That's awesome. Well, congrats. I mean, that's only 5 markets in, and good success so far.
We're very excited. I mean, can't wait to see where this goes. And it's one of those things too. I think it's a little bit akin to the insurance category before Geico started advertising. This is a category that really is kind of it's a low interest category, let's be honest, right? No one is really out Googling for loans unless they need one, right? Also, it's kind of one of those infrequent and unpredictable needs. You don't know when you're going to need a loan. So the direct mail part of it, it's probably a critical piece from a business perspective, but it's a little bit of a crapshoot because you're trying to find the customer at the time that they need a loan. By doing this, we're shifting the dynamic the way the insurance industry has done it to an awareness one. So when you're in that situation, hopefully you'll think of OneMain Financial first.
That's awesome. Is there anything else you want to share about because I think the campaign itself is story driven. Is that right? Very much so. Yeah. Anything you could elaborate in terms of like the types of stories that you're telling through the campaign? So I think, to me, again, this goes back to us, the earlier conversation about what the fundamentals that I learned from Absolut and from Apple, that it really boils down to brand regardless, right? The brand is the heart of what it is, the story you're trying to tell. And marketing is ultimately storytelling, right? It's storytelling in multiple channels, in multiple different ways, but you need to know what your story is before you can start telling it, regardless of whatever channel you have. And that's what we're trying to do, whether it be in social media, whether it be on TV or in radio. We're trying to find those sort of individual, relatable stories that we can tell. Great. Well, Kim, it's a great campaign. I want to switch gears a little bit. And we've gotten to know you a little bit at the beginning because I thought it was great context in terms of how you built this campaign. But we always like to go a little deeper here on Marketing Today with the folks that come on the show. And, I'd love to ask you this question that I ask everyone that comes on the show. Is there an experience of your past that defines or makes up who you are today? Yeah, I think that the answer to that is simply the life experience. And I'm sorry for not picking a very specific one, but I think the fact that I've grew up in West Africa as a Swede, then moved to Sweden, then moved to the US, it's kind of made me into a little bit of a cultural omnivore, always passionate for exploring and understanding and learning more. And that, to me, shaped also why I got into advertising. I think it's a space where you're inevitably searching for paths through culture to communicate a particular story. And that, to me, is, I think, what's so exciting and so intriguing to me. That's interesting. I mean, when you were growing up in West Africa, were you cognizant that you were of Swedish heritage, or did you just think of yourselves as somebody from West Africa?
It's a good question. I think I was never really cognizant. I mean, I think I always knew I was a Swede in a Swedish family.
Right.
And since I didn't know any different, I just happened to be in Africa. It's strange to look at it that way, but there are a lot of people who always say that they always felt like an outsider. I don't think I ever felt really like an outsider. I think I always felt like I was just like a kid from outer space who landed in a particular place or something like that.
Right. You're just different from
Just different, yeah.
but probably still very acculturated to your surroundings because you didn't know anything else at that point.
That's a great way of putting it. Yeah, I think that's exactly what happened because I didn't know any different. I became acculturated to the whatever environment I was in.
That's interesting. It's really interesting. Well, what fuels you? What drives you today?
Passion for creativity. I mean, I majored in art history for a reason. I love the liberal arts and the humanities, and I particularly enjoy the various expressions of them creatively, right? Whether it be music or visual. And I think that the exciting thing about being in a space like marketing and advertising is you get to leverage that on behalf of the storytelling for whatever cause or brand that you're trying to tell a story for. That for me is like the constant in all this and the reward also in all this.
Got it. Well, most marketers tend to be students of the business, and you've illustrated that already in our conversation. But in that notion, are there brands or companies or causes that you follow or you think others should be taking notice of?
I mean, there's so many great brands out there. And like many others, I will say that, you learn about brands very early on an intuitive level. I think Sweden as a brand is a very interesting brand. People have very strong opinions or perceptions of what Sweden is when you say that you're Swedish. The first band that I fell in love with, my heroes when I was a kid, was Kiss. Kiss is a great brand. You learn a lot from looking at things like that. I think today, one of the things that I'm really fascinated with is the discussion around corporate social responsibility that's been going on for quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And the debate whether it should be sort of an add-on, like a philanthropic part where a company gives money, or if it should be something that's integral to how the company does its business, I think is a really interesting one. For me, I've become very passionate about the environmental issues that we're confronted with today. So I very much enjoy seeing what companies like Salesforce and Unilever and 4Ocean, if you know them, the startup that's trying to collect trash out of the ocean. I think that those are really, really interesting things. And I want to spend some time at some point figuring out how we can do that in a way that's more integrated as opposed to giving monies to another organization.
That's great. Well, last question for you, and you have to get out your crystal ball. What do you see as the future of marketing?
I think that, and at the risk of sounding like a fuddy-duddy or Luddite, I think that all these tools that we talked about at the very beginning, the AI, virtual reality, blockchain, all these things are very exciting, and there's definitely going to be impact on that. It's going to change the consumer purchase funnel, the awareness building, so on and so forth. It definitely has an impact. I do think, though, it doesn't change the fundamental. You still need to know what your story is before you venture into them and figure out how you actually leverage them to tell your story. So as the more things change, the more they stay the same to some degree. What I do worry about is I think that when you look at AI, it's sort of on a path of enabling so much personalization that I think we're probably approaching kind of a dangerous crossroads where all this personalization leads to individual silos, which I think we see reflected in culture right now as well. And I think that down the path, that and the combination of all the data that companies are collecting can come to a kind of a critical crossroads in the not too distant future.
Right. No, that's not to get too morbid or creepy, but this notion of alternative realities and that people at the end of the day are still having to interact in the real world, but if they're completely immersed in their own alternative realities, their beliefs, stances, etc., it's troubling to many different
ways. And they're
ways.
reinforced in their individual echo chambers,
Exactly.
And that's what's really scary.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, in the past, there could be kooks out there, of course, but now with these types of individualized and personalized sort of spaces, it's a little bit of a dangerous path, I think.
Yeah, no, I agree. 100%. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been fascinating.
I've really enjoyed it, Alan. Thank you for having me.
Hi, it's Alan again. Marketing Today was created and produced by me, with writing and editing by Kevin Greeley, social media support by Megan Woods, art and graphic design by Sarah Dell. If you're new to Marketing Today, please feel free to write us a review on iTunes or your favorite listening platform. Don't forget to subscribe and tell your friends and colleagues about the show.
I love to hear from listeners, and you can contact me at marketingtodaypodcast.com. There you'll also find complete show notes with links to anything we talk about on any episode. You can also search our archives.
I'm Alan Hart, and this is Marketing Today.